Hello and welcome to another episode of Power, People and Planet. I'm Kumi Naidu and this is a podcast of candid conversations with people who are tackling some of the biggest questions facing humanity at this time. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Nani, Jansen, Reventlow and Markus, Beeko about the role and importance of litigation in this current moment of activism and how might this change in the near future. Nani is an internationally recognized human rights lawyer, specialized in strategic litigation at the intersection of human rights, social justice, and technology. She's the founder of Systemic Justice, the first Black-led majority BIPOC organization in Europe, working to radically transform how the law works for communities fighting for racial, social, and economic justice. Markus Beeko is an old comrade of mine. He was appointed Secretary General of the German section of Amnesty International in 2016. He has been active in leadership positions in Amnesty in Germany, as well as the International Secretariat, at least from 2004. He is currently the chair of Amnesty's International Steering Group on Human Rights in the Digital Age. He chairs the board of trustees of Stichting Menschenrechte, and he's also the vice chair of the board of the German Institute of Human Rights. Nani and Markus, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the challenges of strategic litigation. Let me just quickly frame where this is coming from, right? The contribution of the legal community in terms of making high-level, creative, strategic, innovative interventions in the legal space is probably one of the most interesting, challenging, and important areas of activism today when we think about what role litigation is playing in terms of bringing cases against the fossil fuel industry and other polluting industries. At last count, we understand there's about 1,400 climate lawsuits underway around the world. So just with regard to climate, you can see the importance of litigation. But having said that, I know of a book that's coming out later this year, co-edited by Mark Kafissa, an activist in South Africa, and Katie Redford, who was one of the founders of Earth Rights International, called "This Revolution Will Not Be Litigated," right? And so I guess the conversation we ought to have is not whether we need litigation or not. It's really about, okay, we need it. It's happening on scale. How do we get it much better? How do we get it more strategic? And how we get the proportionality right. So maybe if I could just share a childhood story with you on litigation to just kickstart the conversation. So once when I was about 18 years old, we were fighting a unjust water fine system that had been imposed by the city council. And it was clear that some of the actions that had been taken by the city council created the possibility for us to actually win that case. And I was a young law student at that time, and I went and looked it up and got really excited. Wow, we can win this law case, And then some of the older activists said to me, okay, slow down, young man, slow down. So what if we win it, right? We win it, and then that issue gets ticked off, but the people would not have developed confidence and so on. And they told me quite explicitly, yes, you're right. There's a very good chance we can win that court case, but now is not the time. What you got to do is start the mobilization of the people, make sure people are engaged and so on. So it's the people's law case, not our law case as the leaders, And that was my first lesson as in my teenage years, that law can be useful, but thinking about when you use it, how you use it and so on is a bit more complicated. And truth be said, in the end, that struggle was actually won through the law case, through a legal case. But when it came in the court, we had a whole movement that was sitting there. And had we not done it that way, we might have won the law case, but we wouldn't have any people with us. So with that childhood lesson on strategic litigation, let me ask you to reflect a little bit personally on your experiences and your journeys, right? So, Nani, maybe if we can start with you. How did you come to this work, and exactly what does your work entail today? And what role does litigation play today? Over to you.
Thanks so much, Kumi, and thanks so much for having me here. And it's lovely to share space with you and Markus this morning. That's a really beautiful example that you just gave about the importance of linking litigation efforts with other avenues of action, right? What makes litigation strategic is really how you make sure that it creates synergies with organizing, with public campaigning, with policy work, advocacy work, etc. Because a case on its own is never going to kind of like make all the difference. Even if you win, you might not have enough support to actually be able to implement the outcome or kind of really bring about the change on the ground that you want to affect. For me, having trained first as a lawyer with a law firm, very traditionally, to learn the ropes and get my bar admission finalized, I soon moved to working for an organization in London that was working to defend journalists and bloggers worldwide. This was a wonderful opportunity to really get to litigate in numerous courts around the world and also in a number of international human rights courts. And also for me, it was the way that I discovered, strategic litigation as a really powerful tool for change. Working on cases that could have an impact that went beyond the individual journalists that we were defending, but had an impact on a much wider ecosystem. For example, if you managed to strike down oppressive legislation that was making sure that people got jailed for their expression. So this really fascinated me, and particularly also those opportunities that we had to really work together with others around the case. So not just lawyers, but really with local communities. In case that we worked on at Media Defense at the time, it was quite often with journalist associations and unions, but also working together with academics and with a broader freedom of expression activists. And this prompted me to kind of look into how you could make that work better, and spend some time looking at collaboration around cases. After setting up and running an organization that provided financial support for strategic litigation on digital rights cases in Europe, so human rights in a digital context, I started working on building Systemic Justice Now, where we're really trying to further build on this model of strategic litigation by making sure that the work is really truly community driven. So to come back to your story, Kumi, it's really about making sure that communities and movements are in the driver's seat when it comes to their campaigns for change. Kind of bridging that disconnect that sometimes exists between legal strategies and broader campaigning.
Thank you,
efforts.
Nani. And Markus, I must confess that in inviting both of you, I didn't consciously know that you'll had one very big thing in common, and that is both of you have a huge interest in the digital and technology space as well. In addition to, how does that sound to you, Markus? And just tell us also about your journey a bit, and also how does Amnesty today use strategic litigation? Because I think people would like to know that as well.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And it's great to be here. Thank you, Kumi, for the invitation. And Nani, it's great already now. I'm very happy and looking forward to meet you in person at some point. Yeah, so different than Nani. I'm not a lawyer. Of course, Amnesty International has lots of lawyers, but I'm one of those who are not a lawyer. And my background is from campaigning. I have a campaigning background, and that's how I also started my work at Amnesty. Coming from a communications and campaigning background, also working in other fields of communications, and then with the personal background of a Ghanaian family who was part of the independence struggle, and being raised during a time where South Africa, and Kumi, that's of course at your heart, still was under the apartheid regime. So look, from that point, rather looking at what activism, what campaigning, what public awareness and public pressure brings to the table for change, And so, but I think nevertheless, I think what combines all of this is that if we look at activists in the past, there's good reason why some of them were lawyers. And some of their activism, I think, started in the courtroom. I mean, if you look at, and you will know better, Kumi, but if you look at Gandhi and his early years in South Africa, I think it's just one of the many examples where, of course, lawyers have been activists. And I think what we now are seeing is that activists over the last 20 years have also really welcomed the new avenues, or not the new. I mean, they have been around for ages. I think we are re-exploring over these years the possibilities of strategic litigation and litigation in general. But I also very much share what you said around why is it so important that strategic litigation is connected and grounded with the rights holders, with those communities who are affected. So really having that, the people, having cases, the people against. I think one of the reasons why Amnesty International, since its founding in 1961, one of the main drivers, of course, has always been to establish an international legal framework which guarantees and protects human rights, and then have regional human rights frameworks, and then have national constitutions and laws which guarantee. So, of course, that's an approach which is needed, or which is helpful and supportive of strategic litigation, making sure that there is law which you can go for. But nevertheless, then Amnesty didn't take strategic litigation as a core element, coming from that the organization documents and researches human rights violation and then tries to mobilize people. And I think there's good reason for that, because as you pointed out, it's important to be aligned with constituencies, to be in partnership with rights holders. And that has been a journey for Amnesty. And so I do believe we have a new head of strategic litigation who joined us this year at Amnesty International on a global level. So I think we are looking forward to work with those who are affected, but also the growing community of NGOs, of lawyers, of legal networks who are looking to utilize strategic litigation.
Thank you so much, Markus and Nani. Markus is a very, very humble and understated person. He just threw in his family background there and just moved on. I'll embarrass him by saying that Markus comes from one of the most highly respected families in our continent, the Kwame Nkrumah's family, and somebody who inspires me up to this day and keeps the vision of Pan-Africanism alive. Markus, in that contribution, though, I wanted to just pick up one question there, that is, today, when I look at successful cases that have been brought, when I look at big international NGOs, and both when I was at Greenpeace, when we did something together with the Amnesty in the Netherlands with regard to the toxic waste in West Africa, you might remember that case, and many other cases. What I'm finding right now, that what's really helpful is where there are legal interventions, where there is a strong sense of intersectionality. So, if Greenpeace brings a case on its own, then it's just seen as an environmental thing. If Amnesty brings it on its own, it seems more, only human rights. I think right now, my sense is intersectionality is a critical success factor for all elements of activism. And my question to both of you is, how important is intersectionality even in strategic litigation as an approach? If you could quickly respond to that, Markus, and then I'll go to Nani after that.
Yeah, so Nani, I think, is better set up for the legal implications. But I think from a public awareness point, also besides the substance, it of course enables us to reach out to much, much broader communities and constituencies and stakeholders, as different parts of movements have different access to the public, to important stakeholders. So one thing is on substance, it's important that people understand that things are connected. And because if we're looking, we need a legal framework which actually looks at everything from an intersectional perspective. So that's there. But also, I think it's important that people within society are better capable of getting things together. I think people are struggling with seeing, they're looking at the climate crisis, they understand that it has human rights implications, then there's the energy crisis, but making sense of all of that. Mm-hmm. So I think civil society, I think that's our opportunity to come up with a vision, and you have that new eco-social contract, which you have been talking about. And it's something which has to develop within society. So I think that's also part of the benefit, that together we can initiate a different conversation with people.
Great. Nani, your sense?
Thank you. Intersectionality is crucial, right? For the reasons that Markus just outlined, it's important to have increased awareness across society that, thinking in silos is just not realistic. It's not a reflection of how the world really works. It's super important indeed also to be able to connect movements, to connect struggles, to connect efforts to bring about bigger change. And it's also really important to bring this much, much more to the center when we're talking about litigation efforts. Because it's one of the things that at the moment really is to be frank, is rather lacking from a lot of litigation efforts. And I think especially when we're looking at the climate crisis, it is so urgent to really address the disproportionate harms that marginalized communities and groups in our society are suffering from that. And that those are actually also explicitly addressed in litigation efforts and in campaigns. And, what Markus was just talking about, making sure that the public debate actually takes that into account. And that's something that, we really need to work on. I think that part of the issue there is also making sure that this awareness is also much more present with those who are doing the litigation work. To be, as a lawyer, so I can be a little bit critical about my own profession. We do tend to kind of think in boxes a little bit and think in silos and in little categories, and this is an X case, so we need to approach it this way. And there's so much beautiful work that you can do, being a little bit more creative. And it's also about giving the courts the opportunity to actually transcend those boundaries that we're kind of all voluntarily adhering to at the moment. And then you can have a much more holistic debate, not only about the way that you frame the human rights impact of the challenges that we're facing, but also the way that you look at reparations, the way that you look at restorative justice, and also at community healing.
Let's pose this question though, right? Why now, right, in this sense? I think, firstly, do we all agree that if we take the last 10 years, there has been a noticeable increase in what we can call strategic litigation efforts? We agree that there's an increase, right? So my question is, help the viewers and listeners to understand why is there such an increase? Is it because suddenly the court systems are showing serious progress that they were not showing 10 years ago? Is it because other forms of activism are closing down and therefore this is being taken more seriously? Or is there any other reason why this is taking up? Nani, since you had the flow, just go with it there. What's your sense and why it's growing? Because if we understand that also helps people see what possibilities of intervention there are.
I agree that it's much more visible at the moment, and I agree that there's a huge number of cases at the moment, particularly when you look at climate litigation. But I think that in a way, I'm looking at this more as a wave, if that makes sense. If you look at other movements in the past, so you had a wonderful period of time where in the US, you had the civil rights movement really working hand in glove with litigators, such as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. where you would have like the legal strategies and the movements in the street basically playing off each other. And I think that with climate litigation, which was the big number that you mentioned at the outset, we are now seeing growing public awareness of these issues. There's much more protesting. There's much more public debate. And those two things are kind of like sparking and further kind of like fueling and igniting each other, right? If you ask me, I think I would like to see a lot more litigation going on. I would like to see it being much more actively considered by any movement, as it is such an effective tool that can work together with these other avenues for change. And yeah, one of the things that we really need to do is make sure that it becomes a lot more accessible for collectives, for movements, for communities, and continue building on this momentum, right? Because, as I just mentioned, there's a really big number of cases, and we still need to make sure that this bridge, that we bridge this gap that there is with kind of like grassroots movements and people on the ground and what's happening in the courts.
Thanks, Nani. Markus, what do you attribute the gain in momentum?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers, but my feeling is that the increased perception might also be due to the broader array of issues, be it climate crisis, be it migration, where strategic litigation is not only individual cases, but is really looked at as from different actors to really combine and look at what is happening. And then, of course, we have some developments like universal jurisdiction, which has developed, I think, from what I see. I mean, the possibilities to really take cases to court in different arrays. I think with the increased scrutiny and regulation on business and human rights, also that's also one of the needed things that affected communities have the possibilities to go to court in different constituencies in different countries, and I think, of course, that also might help. The other thing is that I think campaigners and activists, to some degree, in certain areas, have felt frustration with what can be achieved, and so I think the reminding us all that there is a law and we have a legal framework, and this is to be used is just one of things which come to mind to more organizations and more networks, especially as you actually see that if we look at, I mean, so it's good that we have more cases, but what we also see if we look at the world, that there's a huge discrepancy what should be the application of law, and in many areas, be it the climate crisis, be it migration, really more and more systemic violations and systemic problems. And I think litigation holds the promise that it's not just one campaign, but within a campaign and within a joint approach with strategic litigation being part of campaigns, you really get a more sustainable approach, because that is needed for systemic issues and systemic problems.
Yeah, no, in fact, that's a really helpful point. And I've put it slightly differently before. Like I've said to people, finding a jurisdiction that will take your case is the biggest challenge, firstly. Whether you win the case or don't win the case, might not be as important, because if you're using the case to build the campaign, because sometimes the case will open up more democratic space for you to actually talk about it, because the courts have now accepted it. And I think it's just important to just note at this point that while we're talking as if the world is largely similar, we are obviously all three very mindful of the fact that this conversation will sit in different legal jurisdictions in very different ways, depending on the level of independence to the judiciary and so on. But let me push you on a rather controversial question right now, right? If we take climate litigation or the climate struggle, when the scientists are telling us we are fast running out of time, that we've got a clock that's ticking and so on. And then we say, hey, but the strategic litigation stuff, the wheels of justice roll so slowly, and court cases sometimes take 10, 15 years to resolve when they're very complex. How do you respond to that criticism? Is the fact that court cases take so long and then we got a climate clock that's ticking, how do you respond to the fact that, hey, is that the right strategy given how long it takes? How do you respond to that, Nani?
Well, the impact of litigation doesn't necessarily have to come at the end of a court process, right? And I think that's what you were alluding to as well. Like, if you use it in a tactical way, whether you win or lose, and when you win or lose, might not actually be that relevant. And that sounds really kind of like counterintuitive. So it's also thinking about two different things. It's thinking about what constitutes impact, like how are you using litigation in your broader strategy for change? Are you really looking at something particularly, let's say, legal technicality, if I can put it that way? So you want to indeed strike down a law or regulation, or you want more regulation to come into place? Then the question is, like, how are you going to, in the meantime, use this case as a hook to kind of like generate public debate, make sure that awareness is raised, etc. So maybe you might actually get the change through a different avenue while this case is ongoing. Or are you using the case purely to draw attention to an injustice? So in which case you're already planning how you're going to leverage your loss for a win in another arena, right? So there's many different ways in which you can use litigation. And I think we also know that courts can move quickly if they want to. We've seen that. And we've seen that with a number of climate cases also, because it's really clear through public pressure, because it's so high on the public agenda right now, that courts also feel the urgency of dealing with these matters in a more expedient way than they sometimes do.
You agree with it, Markus?
Yeah, totally agree with Nani. I think looking at what strategic litigation can do, it sends so many signals. Just if a case is open, just so just even putting cases together, the research which goes ahead is I think already important. Survivors are being heard, affected communities are being heard, are organized. But I think it sends a clear signal to the public that we need to reframe who is accountable for what, because so far it's often only strategic litigation besides traditional campaigning, which really sends a strong signal. Look, we think this person, this actor, this company is accountable. This government is not taking care of its responsibilities. And just having a court case already puts that question right in the middle. I think it also is an important message for rights holders, for survivors, for affected communities of empowerment. If they see others take cases to court, I think that opens up another space within their thinking. And it sends a signal to perpetrators, to those responsible, to those neglecting their responsibilities. So every case, I think actors are alerted. Look what's happening. We need to take this into consideration. This might happen to us. What are the mitigation risks? And totally with Nani we've seen some speed. Like for instance, if you look like just the German example, I'm now in Frankfurt here, and the German Constitutional Court just last year sent a strong signal to the German government saying, look, your legislation combating the climate crisis is just not enough. Yeah, and is doing injustice to the next generations. You are not taking care of your responsibilities. And the federal government had to go back to their climate legislation, because the Constitutional Court was very clear. You need clear targets, emission targets. They need to be fixed, and that's the responsibility of a government. And the targets which had been set were just too high. I mean, they were not strict enough. The Constitutional Court was clear on that. So I totally agree. It has already impact, and we will see more impact.
Thank you, Markus. Thank you, Nani. My only concern about how we end this conversation is I don't want us to create an impression that all over the world, opportunities for strategic litigation are thriving, right? So there's also closure. And I'd like you to just talk about, are you seeing some governments lobbied by the fossil fuel industry and others saying, hey, this court thing is really making it expensive for us, it's slowing us down, and so on. Right here in South Africa, we've had a major victory against Shell recently, where the impacted communities took Shell and the Minister of Energy to court and stopped seismic testing in a very sensitive part of the ocean, which would have impacted on people's fishing rights and so on. So on the one hand, definitely there's new scope, and that's why we're talking about it. But I have also a sense that in certain places, including in unsuspecting places, there is an attempt to close down the litigation possibilities. And I look at the UK, where, for example, the right to call witnesses in plea of mitigation for certain kinds of civil disobedience factors and so on is being tried to be shut down so as to make sentencing more severe and so on. Can you all reflect quickly on that, Nani? Are you seeing things that are worrying you about shrinking space even for litigation?
Absolutely. And I think it's a pattern, a broader pattern where you see human rights lawyers, activists, coming increasingly under attack and facing hostility of all sorts and kinds. And a lot of this is indeed what you were just referring to the UK. Those are like populist reforms, right? To close down routes to justice. So judicial review is being restricted. They're increasing the chances of cost orders. So the financial risk of litigating, even when you litigate in the public interest, is becoming bigger and bigger. But also kind of like demonizing the legal profession, basically, with, rhetorics about lefty lawyers and activist lawyers and so on, calling judges enemies of the people when they hand down progressive judgments. So there's a lot of... there's actually I would almost call it a campaign, basically, to demonize this kind of work. And the issue of cost also, and just generally like the problem of capitalism, litigation funding, commercial litigation funding is quite often driven by a profit motive, right? So that means that certain kinds of claims will be prioritized for support if people are unable to finance work themselves. So there's a focus on financial remedies, and these issues that I was just referring to that look more at restorative justice will kind of like fall out of the equation there. At the same time, you see legal aid being cut in a number of jurisdictions. So there's a lot of ways also in which the cost and the kind of like capitalist system around our judicial systems is increasing the thresholds more and more of being able to access justice. So that's a really problematic dynamic.
I totally agree. So we see shrinking space. We see pushes to weaken rule of law, as Nani said. So of course they also have impact on the possibilities and the space for strategic litigation. And I mean, Stephen Donzinger's case, just to have one example, Chevron and Stephen Donzinger, even in the US, what we've seen, I mean, I think highlights some of the repression and some of the things we've seen against lawyers and communities using it. Also, the big question.
Sorry, Markus. Just before moving on, I mean, the Stephen Johnson case is one of the most flagrant violations of the rights of a lawyer, and because people might not all know the case, I just thought we'll just take a minute or so. So Stephen was effectively house arrested and tagged. He had to have a metal bracelet. I visited him during his house arrest. It was a horrific situation. Clearly, the fossil fuel companies' lawyers were able to exercise such influence over judges and so on that they were able to distort, the case. So those who don't know the case of Stephen Dosinger, I would strongly urge you to just look it up, because it was one of the flagrant violations of the rights of a human rights lawyer and somebody who paid a huge price, but he did so with amazing dignity and courage, and he's an inspiration, I think, to the legal fraternity right now. Sorry to disturb you there, Markus.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kumi. And I think what we see across the globe is attacks on lawyers, but also targeted surveillance of lawyers within the digital sphere, and others are only part of that. But I think also the big question which we need to look at now is, what will the energy crisis and what will the economic development do? And will that have the impact that even more there will be pressure on courts, governments and corporations exercising jointly pressure on courts and on lawyers and on the whole framework, given that, of course, energy companies have a new role from the perspective of governments and so on. So I think that's to be watched.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, your last comment just made me realize that actually there's this whole kind of movement against activism almost from the lawyers of fossil fuel companies in particular and other polluting industries, which are called SLAPP suits, SLAPP, which, for those of you who don't know, stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. So these are lawsuits that are initiated by big companies with the sole intention to actually stop resistance and stop activism against them. And right now, for example, there's a case being brought by some Canadian companies against Greenpeace in the US. And I've been in some of those cases when I used to be at Greenpeace, where companies are really, they'll actually almost verbalize it. They say, we want to shut Greenpeace up, or we want to shut down this organization so that they never can operate. So can you just reflect, Markus, firstly, on how you're seeing the strategic litigation against public participation, playing it up in the work of Amnesty and its allies, and what you think we can do about it?
Yeah, so I totally agree. And what we have been discussing just in the last minutes is an array of instruments, which are being used by authoritarian governments, by global corporations, to shrink the space and the possibilities. And we see this on various levels. And so, tough question. If we look at what can be done, I think there are many efforts and we're trying. I mean, Amnesty has decided within its global strategic framework as one of the top 2 priorities for the next year to run a big program and campaign. Protect the protest is the label. And it will be looking at some of these developments. I mean, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, but also freedom of access to information, and these different kinds. And so, I mean, within the context of strategic litigation, we already mentioned attacks on lawyers and the attempts to weaken a rule of law and an independent judiciary and judges and so on. We have seen development even in Europe, within the European community, in Hungary and Poland. Just to name that, we have the cases in the US. So not quite sure. I think that's one of the big things. And while it's so important to look at the climate crisis and economic and social and cultural rights, at the same time, we feel that to fight for our rights and to enable people to keep on fighting for their rights, we need to pay attention as an organization to this right to protest, to make sure that we are still able to really ask for our rights.
Thank you, Markus. Your reflections, Nani, on the same question?
Yeah, just focusing on the issue of slaps. They're part of a suite of measures of intimidation, right? It's a form of legal intimidation. It's a way of keeping people distracted by frivolous lawsuits, if I can put it that way. They're much more harmful than just frivolous, but with the view of trying to silence people and silence their criticism. I think that there are no kind of like silver bullets there. It's the usual kind of like way in which you would want to campaign against this. It's raising public awareness. It's making sure that better regulations come into place to be able to dismiss lawsuits like this at a very early stage, so that at least their harm can be limited, right? So people don't have to actually engage for a longer period of time with lawsuits like this. And there are coalitions being built and being expanded at the moment between organizations that are often faced with these kinds of attacks, to indeed kind of make sure that lawmakers have it high on their agenda to actually put regulation in place, but also to mobilize together, because it is one of those areas where it's actually quite fruitful to build coalitions across different thematic areas, because anyone who speaks truth to power can basically be targeted by this.
Thank you both very much for that. I want to shift to a slightly broader area now, and that is, right now, there's a recognition that, especially after COVID and all the inequalities and failures that COVID exposed, there is quite a high level of recognition that the social contract, the commitment of governments to their own people is broken. Some correctly would say that actually it's not broken, it was designed to actually benefit the few and leave the majority with very little. But if tomorrow magically I had the power to come to each of you and say, in your specific countries, I can give you the right to make sure your government has one clause that's really passionate for you, what would be the one clause that you would want to be enshrined in a commitment that your government or governments should make to their citizens? Who would like to go first? Go, Markus.
Thank you, Kumi. Thank you.
You were laughing the most.
So I think trying to look at it in a positive way, at everything, I think, given all the urgency we have, nevertheless, the climate transformation still needs to be an opportunity. It needs to be the opportunity to put equality and human rights and sustainability in the set of goals in which this transformation is being looked at. And we are not yet there, and this would be the clause, the golden rule, which I think that all the transformation processes which are undertaken, they need to have that set of goals which looks at equality, intersectional justice, and human rights as part of the climate crisis transformation. And I don't know, just on a very practical side, I'm just wondering what it would be on a personal level. So that's the question. And on a personal level, I'm wondering whether it would already help that, as you said, Kumi, the world looks different in different places, but still we're in a globalized world which is so connected, and responsibilities and accountability are connected. So I'm just wondering whether on a personal level, we would not all benefit if there would be a way that every one of us is connected to two other very different people at a very different corner of the world. And besides all the big negotiations and the big frameworks, we would set our goal that those 3 or 4 people who are connected need also to work on how is there a balance between what we take and what we give from each other in a small sample, sort of. Thank you.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you so much, Markus. And Nani?
I love this question. And I love Marcus's reference to this being an opportunity, right? I think that we have too much of our current efforts and debates are really about tweaking a status quo rather than reimagining our world and thinking differently about our infrastructure. So what I'm going for is something that really kind of like looks at addressing, the deeply flawed system of oppression and extraction that we have at the moment. And I think that my clause would create an obligation to really end environmental racism by really addressing the historical climate injustices through really thinking about redistributive and decolonial reparations. It's about really going back to the root causes, to the world structure that we created that is at the foundation of this crisis that we're currently in. And then we can build something new and beautiful.
Markus, I'd like to give you a chance to react to that, to Nani's...
I think that's it. I think Nani said it. I think that's it. And I do hope that with all of this, there's so much... The climate crisis has the urgency, but there are other areas like tech. We didn't speak about tech today, but there are other areas which are moving ahead fast. And that's also one reason why it's so important to have strategic litigation to stop things. And that's, I think, what we have been able to do. But if we can really manage to in a constructive way, put all these small pieces together of what our new utopia is. And that's why I like your question so much, Kumi. Yesterday spoke to a sociologist who was wondering, what is the new utopia? I mean, we have a feeling of it, but we need to build it piece by piece. And I think that's what's at the heart of what Nani said. And that's, I think, if we don't do it, no one is going to do it.
Absolutely. And I think that in this enterprise in front of us, and I consciously call it enterprise because I think in this current moment, there is a need to ensure that people feel a sense of optimism, a sense of engagement and so on. But, when I get asked the question on if there's one thing that I want in the social contract, it kind of overlaps with what both of you are saying, but I come down to a very simple thing actually right now, and that is the right to participation, right? Because I think right now, if we are brutally honest with ourselves, we don't know the exact detailed path and journey we have to travel to go forward. We need a culture of emergence, where we are open to the idea that the solutions are going to emerge through co-creation with people who have been shut out from participation before, helping to co-create that moving forward. And that nobody is sitting with a blueprint, And sometimes I do think that activism falls into the trap of putting a pressure on itself to say, we know exactly where things need to go and they have to be, A, B, C, D. So I think right now we are in this world of uncertainty. And I'd conclude this conversation by saying that, there's no question that there is a big place in the difficult struggles ahead for the legal community to play a very massive role. My sense is that that role is best played if it's done with humility, understanding the power that comes with legal qualifications, even in conversations with the community, and to do it in different ways. And that's why I think, Nani's organization, which I had the honor and privilege of stumbling upon, a couple of months ago, as an approach that I want to just conclude with, that just forces us to think differently, in the sense that when donors, for example, ask Nani and her colleagues, please tell us exactly what litigation you're going to be engaged in X, Y, and Z communities, Nani has to say, I don't know, because it's not for me to decide. It's for the communities that we're working with to actually evolve what are the key things they want to drive on. And so right now, I would end by also putting a challenge to philanthropy, that I think the philanthropic world must also really recognize that if we are saying that it cannot be business as usual, we're also saying it cannot be philanthropy or activism as usual either. And this moment is one for searching. And I do think that the legal community has a big role to play in helping to shape those transformations and also to be part of it. Nani, Jansen, Reventlow, Markus, Beeko, thank you so very, very much for all that you do in your work, of all the inspiration you've offered to the world already, and for all that I'm sure you're going to do in the months and years ahead. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Nani. Thank you, Kumi.
Thank you, Kumi. Thank you, Markus. This was great.
Once again, thank you to our listeners and viewers for joining our discussion. Please don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe and all those fun things that you'll do. Your support makes a difference. See you next time. I was about to say, see you in court, but I hope if we're going to see you in court, you will be the one who are bringing the litigation for justice. Thank you very, very much.